The gavel falls. The courtroom exhales. And in the brief, hollow quiet that follows a death sentence, something irreversible happens. Not just to the person standing before the judge, but to time itself. From that moment on, life no longer moves forward in the ordinary way. It narrows. It slows. It hardens. For a condemned prisoner in Texas, the sentence does not mean an immediate end. It means a different kind of beginning, one defined by waiting, isolation, routine, and the constant presence of an ending that has already been scheduled in principle, if not yet in ink. Most people imagine death row as a place of screaming sirens, last meals, and dramatic final words. That image is comforting in its simplicity, because it keeps the truth at a safe distance. The reality is far quieter, far colder, and far more relentless. Death row in Texas is not about dying quickly. It is about living for years, sometimes decades, under a sentence that never leaves a room. After sentencing, the condemned man is not rushed to an execution chamber. Instead, he is processed, photographed, stripped of personal identity, and transported away from the public eye. Chains bite into wrists and ankles. Doors close in sequence. Each sound, the clank of steel, the buzz of electronic locks, marks another step away from the world he once knew. By the time he arrives at death row, the transition has already begun. From citizen to inmate, from inmate to condemned. The cell is small, smaller than most people expect. Concrete, steel, and little else. The lights never fully feel like night, and silence is never complete. This is where time takes on a strange shape. Days are measured not by events, but by routines. Meal slots, count times, showers allowed only a few times a week. Movement is minimal. Human contact even less. For many, the most consistent voice they hear belongs to a guard giving orders through a slot in the door. What truly defines death row is not violence, but isolation. Texas death row inmates typically spend more than 23 hours a day alone. No communal dining. No work assignments. No wandering the yard with other prisoners. Recreation, when permitted, happens in solitary cages, chain-link enclosures under the open sky, where the sun feels distant and freedom feels almost cruel in its visibility. Conversations, when they happen at all, are shouted through walls or exchanged in fragments during escorted movements. Psychologically, the sentence begins to work immediately. Appeals are filed, lawyers assigned, paperwork stacked high with legal language that promises hope while rarely delivering it quickly. Every appeal delays death, but also prolongs the wait. And waiting on death row is its own punishment. Each year that passes is both a victory and a burden. Survival becomes routine, but the future never becomes normal. Families react in different ways. Some disappear entirely, unable to reconcile love with the weight of the crime. Others remain, clinging to phone calls at last minutes and visits separated by thick glass. For the condemned, these connections are lifelines and reminders of everything already lost. Birthdays are marked by memory alone. Funerals happen without them. Life outside continues, visible only through letters and second-hand stories. Then there is the constant presence of execution. Even when no date is set, it is always there. Every sound of keys in the corridor raises the same question. Is this the day something changes? When execution dates are finally scheduled, the atmosphere on death row shifts. The calendar becomes an enemy. Sleep becomes fractured. Some inmates become hyper-religious. Others withdraw completely. A few break down in ways no report will ever fully capture. What makes Texas death row especially haunting is its efficiency and certainty. This is a system that has practiced the mechanics of execution for decades. The condemned know this. They hear about executions down the row. They feel the absence left behind when a cell goes permanently silent. The message is unspoken but unmistakable. This place does not forget its purpose. And yet, life continues, strangely, stubbornly. Men read. They write. They exercise in cramped spaces. Some mentor younger inmates through letters. Some maintain innocence with unwavering conviction. Others live with guilt that has nowhere to go. Death row is not a single emotional state. It is a collection of private wars fought behind identical doors. This is a part of the justice system rarely shown. Not the crime, Not the trial, not even the execution, but the long, quiet stretch in between, where punishment is not a moment, but a lifetime compressed into a concrete box. Because in Texas, a death sentence is not just about how a man will die. It is about how he is forced to live until the state decides the waiting is over. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. The moment a Texas jury returns a verdict of death, the legal process pauses just long enough for reality to settle in. Then it moves with cold precision. There is no dramatic collapse, no cinematic chaos. The condemned man is usually standing, sometimes seated, often numb. The judge reads the sentence in measured tones, bound by statute and procedure. The words are familiar to everyone in the room, yet their weight is absolute. Death by lethal injection. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, unless the law itself changes its mind. From that instant, the individual is no longer treated as an ordinary inmate. The transformation begins immediately. Handcuffs are applied. Leg irons follow. Courtroom deputies escort the condemned out a side door, away from public view, away from family members who may still be crying, frozen in their seats. The trial is over, but the punishment is only beginning. The immediate aftermath, within hours, sometimes the same day, the condemned prisoner is transferred to a holding facility. This short period is often the most disorienting. The adrenaline of the trial drains away, replaced by exhaustion and shock. Many inmates later describe this window as surreal, like watching someone else's life unravel from a distance. Guards are professional, procedural, emotionally neutral. There is no cruelty, but no comfort either. The system is already moving on. Personal property is inventoried. Clothing is exchanged for prison-issued garments. Jewelry, paperwork, photographs, everything that once signaled individuality, is boxed, logged, and stored. Identity becomes a number, a classification, a file thick with transcripts and judgments. The condemned is now officially marked for death under Texas law. In the days that follow, paperwork dominates life. Defense attorneys explain the appeals process. Direct appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Federal habeas petitions, years of litigation ahead. The words automatic appeal sound reassuring, but they offer no emotional relief. Appeals mean delay, not reversal. Most men understand this instinctively, even if no one says it aloud. The transfer to death row. When transport finally happens, it is quiet and deliberate. The condemned is shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles. Movement is slow, controlled. Armed officers escort the transport vehicle. Sometimes unmarked, sometimes unmistakably official. Windows are small or non-existent. The outside world becomes a blur of highways and sky. Freedom visible but unreachable. Texas houses its male death row inmates at the Pulaski unit, located in a remote area far from major cities. The isolation is intentional. By the time the transport gates close behind the vehicle, the geography alone reinforces the message. This place is not meant to be temporary. The intake process at death row is thorough. Medical evaluations are conducted. Mental health screenings are performed, though critics argue they are often cursory. Fingerprints are taken again. Photographs are updated. The condemned is issued basic supplies. Soap, toothbrush, limited hygiene items. Everything is standardized. Nothing is personal. Then comes the cell that becomes a world. A Texas death row cell is small, typically concrete on all sides, with a steel door and a narrow window slot. Inside, a bunk bolted to the wall, a thin mattress, a stainless steel sink and toilet combination, and a small writing surface. That is it. No bars. No open air. No ability to see more than a sliver of the corridor outside. For many inmates, this is the first moment the sentence becomes real, not the verdict, not the words. The cell, because this is where life will happen now. Nearly all of it, every day, year after year. The door closes with sound that becomes unforgettable, a mechanical finality. The kind of sound that does not echo but still feels permanent. From this point on, the condemned will spend approximately 23 hours a day inside this space. Death row classification and rules. Texas death row operates under strict classification rules. Unlike general population inmates, condemned prisoners are not eligible for work programs, educational classes, or communal activities. The logic is security. The effect is isolation. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door. Trays slide in. Trays slide out. There is no dining hall, no conversation over food. Recreation, when allowed, occurs alone in a small, fenced enclosure, often described as a dog run, where inmates can walk in circles under the open sky for about an hour. Some days, even that is canceled due to staffing shortages or security concerns. Showers are limited. Phone calls are monitored and restricted. Visits, when permitted, are conducted through thick glass with communication via phone. Physical contact is forbidden. A hand pressed against glass becomes the closest thing to a hug. Mail becomes sacred. Letters are read and reread until paper thins and ink fades. For many, writing becomes a primary way to assert existence, to prove they are still thinking, still human, still alive. Psychological impact. The first cracks. The early months on death row are often the most psychologically volatile. Some inmates experience severe depression. Others swing toward manic activity, writing nonstop, exercising obsessively, talking loudly to themselves just to fill the silence. Sleep patterns collapse. Nights stretch endlessly. Days blur together. Mental health services exist on paper, but access is limited. Counseling sessions are brief and infrequent. Medication is common. Silence is constant. The knowledge that execution is not imminent, but inevitable, creates a unique strain. It is not the fear of dying tomorrow. It is the certainty of dying someday without knowing when. Some inmates begin constructing routines immediately. Push-ups at dawn, reading blocks of time, writing letters every afternoon. Routine becomes survival. Without it, the mind drifts toward places that are difficult to return from. Relationships on the outside. Family relationships often fracture during this stage. Some relatives stop answering calls, overwhelmed by shame, anger, or grief. Others become fiercely loyal, attending every permitted visit, funding appeals, writing weekly letters. Both responses leave scars. For inmates with children, the pain is sharper. They miss birthdays, graduations, entire childhoods. Their presence in family life becomes symbolic rather than physical. An absence felt more strongly than a presence ever could be. Romantic relationships rarely survive intact. Time, distance, and stigma take their toll. Even when love remains, it is reshaped into something constrained by glass, schedules, and surveillance. Learning the language of death row. Every prison has its own language, and death row is no different. Inmates quickly learn the sounds of the unit, which footsteps belong to which guards, the timing of counts, the subtle change in atmosphere when something is wrong. They learn to read silence as carefully as noise. They also learn about execution procedures, not from official briefings, but from whispered conversations, legal mail, and the empty cells left behind after an execution. When a man is put to death, his absence is immediate and permanent. His property is removed. His name is no longer called. The silence is louder than any announcement, the beginning of a long wait. By the end of first year, most condemned inmates understand a hard truth. Death row is not about preparing to die. It is about learning how to live under a sentence designed to erase the future. If the first days on death row are defined by shock, the months and years that follow are defined by something far more difficult to endure, repetition. Once the routines are learned and the fear settles into a dull, constant pressure, life on Texas death row becomes a slow grind where days blur together. Seasons lose meaning and time itself feels distorted. This is not chaos. It is order taken to an extreme, and that is precisely what makes it so psychologically destructive. Death row is designed to be controlled, predictable, and sterile. Every movement is regulated. Every interaction is supervised. Every privilege is conditional. For condemned inmates housed under the authority of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, daily life is stripped down to its most basic functions: waking, eating, waiting, sleeping. Over time, The absence of meaningful variation becomes its own form of punishment, a day measured in locks and counts. A typical day on Texas death row begins early. Lights come on while it is still dark outside. Guards conduct the first inmate count of the day, visually confirming each prisoner through the small window in the steel door. Counts happen repeatedly, sometimes 5 or more times a day. Each count interrupts thought, sleep, and routine, reinforcing one message: you are always being watched. Breakfast arrives on a tray pushed through a narrow slot. The food is basic, nutritionally sufficient, and emotionally forgettable. There is no choice, no customization, no shared table. Meals are eaten alone, often in silence, sometimes while standing or sitting on the edge of the bunk. For many inmates, food becomes less about hunger and more about marking time. Breakfast means morning has arrived. Lunch means a day is halfway gone. Dinner means another day has been survived. After breakfast, there is nothing resembling a normal schedule. No work assignments. No classrooms. No programs to attend. The hours stretch open, unstructured and heavy. In general population prisons, inmates complain about monotony, but they are surrounded by people, noise, movement. On death row, monotony is paired with isolation, creating a mental vacuum that is difficult to escape. Solitary confinement as a way of life. Texas death row inmates live in conditions that closely resemble long-term solitary confinement. They spend more than 23 hours a day alone in their cells. For years, sometimes decades, human beings are not built for this. Studies consistently show that prolonged isolation leads to anxiety, depression, paranoia, memory problems, and emotional instability. On death row, these effects are not side effects. They are expected outcomes. The system is not designed to rehabilitate condemned inmates. It is designed to contain them until execution or death from other causes. Conversation, when it happens, is fragmented and distant. Inmates may shout to each other through doors or ventilation gaps, exchanging bits of information, jokes, or encouragement. These interactions are brief and often discouraged. Still, they matter. For many, hearing another human voice, even distorted and incomplete, is the only reminder that the world has not entirely disappeared. Over time, some inmates stop trying to communicate at all. Silence becomes easier than hope. Others cling to conversation obsessively, talking loudly to themselves or inventing routines that include imagined dialogue. Guards witness this every day. It is rarely documented. Recreation. Freedom in a cage. Recreation time is one of the few opportunities death row inmates have to leave their cells. When permitted, they are escorted, shackled, to small, individual recreation enclosures. These spaces are typically concrete and chain link, just large enough to pace a few steps in each direction. The sky is visible. So is the razor wire. For about an hour, inmates can walk, stretch, exercise, or simply stand and feel the air. Some close their eyes and tilt their faces toward the sun, try to absorb warmth like a resource that might run out. Others pace relentlessly, burning off nervous energy. Some sit quietly, conserving strength. Recreation is not guaranteed. Staffing shortages, lockdowns, or security concerns can cancel it without notice. When that happens, inmates remain in their cells for days at a time without stepping outside. The loss is felt immediately, physically and mentally. Muscles weaken, tempers shorten, thoughts spiral inward. The role of mail and writing. On death row, mail is more than communication. It is survival. Letters from family, friends, activists, religious groups, and sometimes complete strangers become emotional anchors. Inmates read them slowly, carefully, returning to favorite passages again and again. Envelopes are kept long after the paper inside has been memorized. Writing, too, becomes essential. Many death row inmates write constantly: letters, journals, poetry, legal notes. Writing creates structure. It fills hours. It allows thoughts to exist outside the mind, where they can be examined instead of endlessly recycled. Some inmates write to maintain innocence. Others write confessions they will never send. Some document daily life in painstaking detail, as if recording reality might somehow make it more bearable or more real. For a few, writing becomes legacy. a way to leave something behind when everything else has been taken. Visits through glass. Visits on Texas death row are rare, tightly controlled, and emotionally intense. Visitors are searched thoroughly. Identification is checked. Rules are strict. When a visit finally begins, inmate and visitor sit on opposite sides of thick glass, communicating through a phone. There is no physical contact, no hand-holding, no embrace. Even a finger pressed against the glass is sometimes discouraged. Conversations are monitored. Time is limited. For families, these visits are exhausting. For inmates, they are both a lifeline and a source of pain. Seeing loved ones age, struggle, or grow distant through a barrier reinforces the cost of the sentence in ways no court transcript ever could. After visits, many inmates experience emotional crashes. The reminder of what exists beyond the walls can make the isolation feel sharper than before. Some choose to stop accepting visits altogether, deciding the pain of connection outweighs the comfort, sleep or the lack of it. Sleep on death row is rarely restful. Lights, noise, and anxiety disrupt natural rhythms. Inmates often sleep in short bursts, waking frequently. Dreams are vivid, repetitive, and sometimes indistinguishable from waking thoughts. Night is when the mind becomes most dangerous. Without distractions, memories resurface. Guilt, denial, anger, fear, all take turns demanding attention. Some inmates pray, some pace. Some lie still, staring at the ceiling until morning arrives. Medication is common. Antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, sleep aids. They help some inmates function. For others, they dull emotions at the cost of clarity. Refusing medication is allowed, but the untreated effects of isolation can be worse. The slow, psychological shift. As years pass, a subtle but profound transformation occurs. Inmates stop counting days and start counting events. Court rulings, executions of others, holidays marked only by different meals. Time becomes abstract. The future shrinks to the next appeal, the next visit, the next letter. Some inmates adopt rigid routines and cling to them fiercely. Any disruption, a delayed meal, a canceled shower, can trigger intense distress. On Texas death row, time is not measured only by days and years. It is measured by paperwork, by filings, by court dates that come and go without answers, by decisions written in legal language so dense they feel almost deliberately distant from human life. This is a long middle stage of a death sentence, the part that rarely makes headlines, where condemned inmates exist in a legal limbo that can last longer than some lifetimes. From the outside, appeals are often misunderstood. Many people believe that a death sentence automatically leads to endless chances, loopholes, and second guesses. From the inside, appeals feel very different. They are not opportunities so much as obligations. Procedural steps that must be taken, regardless of how slim the chances of success may be. Refusing to appeal is rare, because appeals are the only barrier standing between a condemned inmate and an execution date. But that barrier is thin, and it is designed to test endurance as much as legality. The automatic appeal, hope by design, delay by reality. Every death sentence in Texas triggers an automatic direct appeal. This first stage is reviewed by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest criminal court. Unlike trial courts, this body does not hear new evidence or witness testimony. It reviews the trial record for legal errors, mistakes in procedure, jury instructions, evidence handling, or constitutional violations. For the condemned inmate, this appeal often begins months after sentencing. During that time, life on death row continues unchanged. The appeal exists mostly on paper, handled by attorneys who may visit infrequently and communicate primarily through letters. Inmates read transcripts of their own trials, sometimes thousands of pages long, reliving every detail line by line. The questions considered are technical, not emotional. Was the jury selection conducted properly? Were mitigating factors presented adequately? Did the prosecution overstep constitutional boundaries? Even when errors are found, they are often ruled harmless, meaning they did not significantly affect the outcome. For most inmates, the direct appeal ends in denial. State habeas corpus, the last internal door. After the direct appeal, the process moves into state habeas corpus proceedings. This is where claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, suppressed evidence, or newly discovered facts are typically raised. In theory, this is where deeper injustices can be corrected. In practice, it is one of the most complex and slow-moving stages of the process. Habeas petitions can take years to prepare. Investigators may attempt to track down old witnesses, locate missing records, or uncover evidence that was never presented at trial. For inmates, this period is defined by waiting without updates. Months pass with no word, sometimes years. When communication does come, it is often discouraging. Evidence has been lost. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Standards of proof are high, and courts are reluctant to reopen cases that have already passed through multiple layers of review. For the condemned, state habeas is often the stage where hope begins to narrow dramatically, not because innocence or unfairness has been disproven, but because the system has grown tired of asking questions. Federal courts, a narrower path. Once state remedies are exhausted, cases move into federal court. Federal habeas corpus petitions are reviewed under strict rules designed to respect state court decisions. This is not a second trial. It is not even a full review. Federal judges are limited to determining whether the state court's decision was unreasonable under clearly established federal law. This standard is intentionally difficult to meet. For inmates, federal review often feels like arguing over shadows of shadows, debating whether previous courts debated properly, rather than whether justice was actually done. Claims that might seem compelling on a human level often fail on technical grounds. Cases can move from federal district court to circuit courts, and in rare instances, to the Supreme Court of the United States. But the odds are steep. The Supreme Court accepts only a tiny fraction of death penalty cases each year. Most petitions are denied without explanation. Each denial is communicated through legal mail, formal, unemotional, final in tone. Inmates learn to read these letters carefully, searching for meaning between the lines. Sometimes there is none. Time is a weapon. What makes the appeals process uniquely punishing is its length. A Texas death row inmate may spend 10, 15, even 20 years appealing a sentence. From the outside, this looks like mercy. From the inside, it feels like slow erosion. Years pass without resolution. Inmates age. Parents die. Children grow up. Lawyers change. Laws evolve. Sometimes just too late to matter. The condemned exist in a suspended state, neither alive in any meaningful sense nor allowed to die. This prolonged uncertainty takes a heavy psychological toll. Some inmates obsess over legal details, memorizing case law and deadlines. Others detach entirely, unable to endure the emotional highs and lows of the process. A favorable ruling can spark hope that lasts for months, only to be crushed by the next denial. The system demands patience while offering no timeline. There is no countdown clock. There is only waiting. Execution dates, when waiting becomes real. At some point, often after years of litigation, the state may request an execution date. This is the moment when the abstract becomes concrete. A date appears on paper. A time is assigned. The future collapses into a single point. When an execution date is set, everything changes. Legal teams scramble to file last-minute appeals. Investigations intensify. Clemency petitions are prepared. The pace accelerates violently after years of stagnation. For the inmate, this period is often the most emotionally extreme. Hope and despair coexist in rapid cycles. One day brings a stay of execution. The next brings denial. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. Every sound in the corridor feels loaded with meaning. Some inmates begin preparing for death, writing final letters, deciding on last meals, speaking with spiritual advisors. Others refuse to engage, convinced the date will be stayed at the last moment. Sometimes they are right. Often they are not. When a stay is granted, the emotional whiplash is intense. Relief is immediate, but it is followed quickly by exhaustion and dread. Because a stay does not mean freedom. It only means more waiting. Clemency, mercy as a formality. Clemency is often described as a final safeguard against injustice. In Texas, it is granted rarely. Requests are reviewed by the Board of Pardons and Paroles and ultimately decided by the governor. The process is opaque. Decisions are brief. Explanations are minimal or non-existent. For inmates, clemency represents hope stripped down to its most fragile form. It is not about legal arguments anymore. It is about mercy, an unpredictable and often political concept. Most clemency petitions are denied. The cost of endless review. From the outside, the appeals process appears thorough, even excessive. From the inside, it feels exhausting and dehumanizing. Condemned inmates are required to participate in a system that constantly revisits their worst moments without offering resolution. Some eventually give up. They waive further appeals, choosing execution over endless waiting. This decision is often misinterpreted as acceptance of guilt or desire for death. There's a moment on Texas death row when uncertainty ends, not with relief, but with dread. It arrives quietly, often in the form of a thin envelope delivered through the slot in a steel door. Inside is a legal notice, written in formal language, calmly stating what the inmate has known for years but hoped would never fully materialize. An execution date has been set. Until this moment, death has existed in theory. Now it exists on a calendar. For condemned inmates, this is when time changes shape again. The years of waiting, appeals, and legal maneuvering collapse into weeks, sometimes days. The long limbo that once felt endless suddenly feels brutally short. And with that shift comes a psychological pressure unlike anything else in the prison system. When the date is set, execution dates in Texas are typically scheduled months in advance, but the emotional impact is immediate. The condemned inmate is informed officially. Guards remain professional, controlled, neutral, but the gravity of the moment is unmistakable. Some inmates react visibly, shaking, pacing, collapsing onto the bunk. Others remain still, eerily calm, as if the news has finally aligned reality with expectation. Word spreads quickly along death row. Other inmates know what it means. Conversations, already sparse, become hushed. Some offer shouted words of support. Others retreat into silence, unwilling to imagine themselves next. From this point forward, every action feels loaded with meaning. Every day is numbered. Legal frenzy, the last wall of paper. Once an execution date is set, attorneys enter emergency mode. Last-minute appeals are filed in state and federal courts. Claims that were previously denied are reframed. New evidence, if any exists, is rushed forward. Requests for stays of execution are submitted, sometimes hours before the scheduled time of death. For the inmate, this period is emotionally exhausting. Hope surges and crashes repeatedly. One court issues a temporary stay. Another dissolves it. The phone rings with updates that can change everything or nothing. Sleep becomes fragmented or disappears entirely. Some inmates stay awake for days, terrified that falling asleep will mean missing a critical update. Others sleep excessively, using exhaustion as an escape. This stage exposes one of the cruelest aspects of the system. The mind is forced to prepare for death while still being asked to believe it might not happen. Movement toward the end. As execution day approaches, the condemned inmate is transferred from the Pulaski unit to the Huntsville unit, where executions are carried out. This transfer usually occurs days before the scheduled execution. The journey is heavily guarded and silent. Chains are plied again. The same restraints used years earlier now feel heavier, not physically, but symbolically. The inmate knows this is likely the final transport of his life. At Huntsville, the conditions change subtly but unmistakably. The cell is still small. The walls are still concrete. But the atmosphere is different. This is not a place of waiting. It is a place of endings. Guards assigned to death watch rotate shifts, maintaining constant observation. The condemned inmate is never truly alone now. Every movement is noted. Every action is recorded. Suicide prevention becomes paramount. Not out of compassion alone, but because the state intends to carry out the execution itself. The psychology of the final days. The final days on death row are psychologically extreme. Some inmates become intensely reflective, revisiting memories in obsessive detail. Others dissociate, emotionally shutting down to survive the unbearable pressure. Faith often intensifies during this period. Chaplains are requested more frequently. Prayer, confession, and spiritual counseling become central rituals. Even inmates who previously rejected religion may reach for it. Not always for salvation, but for structure, meaning, or comfort. Guilt and innocence collide violently here. Inmates who maintain innocence often cling to it fiercely, convinced that acknowledgement of guilt would mean surrendering the last piece of themselves. Those who accept responsibility may struggle with overwhelming remorse, knowing there is no way to undo the harm they caused. Both experiences are isolating. There is no resolution that satisfies a mind when death is days away. Final visits, goodbye through glass. In the final days, visits may be extended. Family members are notified. Loved ones travel long distances, often with little notice. These visits are some of the most emotionally devastating moments of the entire process. There is still no physical contact. Conversations are filled with unfinished sentences, forced calm, and quiet desperation. Parents try to be strong. Children struggle to understand. Spouses and partners search for words that do not exist. Some inmates attempt to comfort their families, minimizing their own fear to ease the pain of those watching. Others break down completely, overwhelmed by the reality of permanent separation. When the visit ends, guards signal quietly. The phone is hung up. The inmate is escorted back to his cell. That may be the last time he ever sees another face not dressed in a uniform. The last meal and final preparations. Texas allows condemned inmates to choose a final meal within certain limits. For some, this becomes a meaningful ritual, a reminder of individuality and choice in a system that has stripped both away. Others decline the meal entirely, unable or unwilling to participate. Food is delivered hours before execution. Sometimes it goes untouched. The inmate is allowed to shower. Clean clothes are provided. Paperwork is completed. Final statements are discussed. The chaplain remains nearby if requested. This preparation phase is clinical and procedural. There is no drama, no raised voices. Everything is designed to function smoothly, efficiently, without interruption. That efficiency is part of what makes it so disturbing. The walk toward the chamber. As execution time approaches, the inmate is escorted to the execution chamber. Strapped, guided, surrounded by guards trained to remain detached, he is led down a corridor that few people ever walk, and no one ever returns from. The chamber itself is stark. A gurney, restraints, intravenous lines prepared by medical personnel who do not speak beyond what is necessary. Witnesses assemble behind glass, victims' families, inmate representatives, officials, reporters. The condemned is secured to the gurney. Straps are tightened. Lines are inserted. The process is methodical. At this point, all legal avenues are closed unless a last-minute stay arrives. Sometimes it does, minutes before the drugs are administered. More often, it does not. Final words. Texas allows a final statement. Some inmates speak calmly, offering apologies, forgiveness, or declarations of innocence. Others remain silent. Silence, in this context, can be as powerful as any speech. The words spoken or withheld become part of the official record. They are reported, quoted, archived. For the inmate, they are the final act expression allowed by the state. When the waiting ends, once the lethal injection begins, the long wait that defined death row life ends abruptly. Years of isolation, appeals, routines, and psychological endurance collapse into minutes. Every execution reinforces the reality that waiting is not endless, that every cell, no matter how long it remains occupied, is temporary. And for the men still waiting behind those doors, the question becomes sharper than ever. Whose turn is next? An execution does not end when the drugs stop flowing. It does not end when a body is pronounced dead, or when witnesses are escorted from the chamber, or when the official time of death is logged into state records. In Texas, an execution sends ripples that move outward, through families, prison staff, victims, loved ones, and the men still locked behind steel doors on death row. What follows is quieter than the buildup, but in many ways, heavier. This chapter is about that aftermath, the part almost never shown. The human cost that continues long after the state has declared justice served. For the victims' families, closure is not guaranteed. For families of murder victims, the execution is often framed as closure, a final chapter, an end to years, sometimes decades, of waiting, appeals, hearings, and reminders of unimaginable loss. But closure is not a switch that flips on the night of an execution. Some families do feel relief. For them, the execution represents accountability, a line drawn under a long and painful process. They speak of finally being able to sleep, to breathe, to stop checking court calendars. The legal process that has dominated their lives for years is finally over. Others feel something far more complicated. Watching another human being die, even the person responsible for destroying your family, can reopen wounds instead of closing them. The execution does not bring back the dead. It does not erase the trauma. And for some, it introduces new questions that linger long after the chamber goes silent. Did this actually help? Did this change anything? Why do I still feel empty? Victims' families are not a single voice. They are individuals, each carrying grief differently. The justice system often speaks for them in absolutes. Their lived reality is rarely so simple. The condemned's family, grief without sympathy. If victims' families carry visible grief, the families of the condemned often carry theirs in silence. Public sympathy is rare. Their loss is frequently dismissed, minimized, or even attacked. Yet their grief is real. Parents bury sons. Children lose fathers. Siblings lose brothers. And they do so under a cloud of shame, judgment, and isolation. Many families are ostracized in their communities. Some hide the truth entirely, telling neighbors their loved one died in prison without explaining how. For years, these families participated in a ritual of hope and fear, appeals filed, stays granted, dates postponed. Execution ends that cycle brutally. There are no more phone calls to wait for, no more visits to plan, no more legal updates, just absence. Some families find relief in knowing their loved one is no longer suffering under death row conditions. Others are consumed by anger at the system, at the lawyers, at themselves. Many struggle with unresolved guilt, wondering if they could have done more. Their grief is rarely acknowledged publicly, but it exists all the same. Prison staff, carrying out death. Executions do not happen on their own. They are carried out by people, guards, medical staff, administrators, many of whom return home to ordinary lives after their shifts end. For prison staff, executions are described officially as duties, procedures, responsibilities. Unofficially, they are burdens. Some staff members compartmentalize completely. They treat execution duty as another assignment, emotionally detached, professionally executed. This psychological distancing is often necessary for survival in a job that demands both control and humanity. Others are deeply affected, even if they never speak about it. Witnessing death repeatedly, especially under controlled clinical circumstances, can leave lasting scars, nightmares, emotional numbness, increased substance use, strained relationships. These effects are rarely studied openly and even more rarely discussed within prison culture, where toughness is expected and vulnerability discouraged. Unlike inmates or families, prison staff have no appeals process, no closure ritual. When an execution ends, they clean the room, reset the space, and prepare for the next one. The system moves on. So must they. Death row after an execution. When an execution occurs, death row itself changes, subtly but unmistakably. The executed inmate's cell is cleared. Property is removed. The door is cleaned. The space becomes empty, waiting. For the men still condemned, this emptiness is louder than any announcement. They knew him, or they didn't, but they knew of him. They heard his voice through walls. They exchanged words during recreation. They marked time alongside him. Now he is gone. Some inmates grieve quietly. Others retreat inward, shaken by how real the process has become again. A few grow angry, lashing out verbally or emotionally. For many, fear intensifies, not always of death itself, but of the waiting. Executions serve as reminders, not warnings, reminders. Every man on death row knows the same thing. The system has proven it will follow through. The psychological wake. After an execution, a strange calm sometimes settles over death row. Conversations drop off. Routine becomes rigid. Inmates focus inward, recalibrating their mental defenses. Some men begin preparing emotionally for their own deaths long before any date is set. Others double down on legal hope, filing motions, studying case law obsessively. A few withdraw completely, shutting down as a form of self-protection. There is also survivor's guilt, rarely acknowledged but deeply felt. Why did he die while I remain? Why does appeals fail while mine continue? This guilt could be especially heavy for inmates who share similar cases, timelines, or legal arguments. Death row is a community formed by circumstance, not choice. And when one member is removed permanently, the absence reverberates. Public memory versus private reality. Outside the prison walls, executions quickly fade from public attention. News articles are published. Statements are issued. Social media debates flare briefly, then die down. Another story replaces it. Inside, the impact lingers. The execution becomes part of institutional memory, referenced quietly in conversations, legal discussions, and internal reports. For inmates and staff, it is not an abstract issue. It is something witnessed, heard, felt. This disconnect between public discourse and private reality is one of the defining features of capital punishment. The act is public. The consequences are not. Justice, punishment, and the question that remains. Texas executes more prisoners than any other state. The system is efficient, experienced, and legally fortified. Supporters argue it delivers justice, deters crime, and honors victims. Critics argue it perpetuates trauma, risks irreversible error, and inflicts suffering beyond the condemned. What is often missing from this debate is an honest examination of life after execution. Does it heal? Does it satisfy? Does it prevent future violence? The answers vary, depending on who is asked. For some, the execution is the end of a long nightmare. For others, it is simply another loss layered onto existing pain. The silence that follows. When the chamber doors close and witnesses leave, silence settles in. Not peace, not resolution. Silence. It exists in the empty cell, in the families driving home at night, in the guards removing their uniforms, in the men still waiting behind steel doors. Death row continues operating the next day. Breakfast is served. Counts are taken. Appeals are filed. The system does not pause to reflect. Life on death row in Texas is not a single moment, not a needle, not a final statement spoken behind glass. It is a long, grinding process that begins the instant a sentence is read and stretches across decades of isolation, legal battles, and psychological survival. It is lived in small concrete cells, measured in meal trays and court filings, and haunted by a future that is always present but never fully defined, until it suddenly is. For the condemned, death row is not about dying quickly. It is about living while knowing the ending has already been written. It is about learning to exist in a space where time no longer behaves normally, where hope must be rationed, and where identity slowly erodes under the weight of waiting. Some men cling to faith. Some cling to innocence. Some cling only to routine. All are shaped by the same relentless question. How long? For victims' families, the process is equally unforgiving. Years of appeals keep wounds open, forcing them to relive loss again and again. For some, execution brings relief. For others, it brings only another kind of silence, one that does not heal but lingers. Justice, in this context, is not a universal experience. It is personal, complicated, and often incomplete. For prison staff, death row is a place of duty carried out behind professional restraint. Executions become procedures. But the human cost does not disappear simply because it is managed quietly. And for the men left behind on death row, every execution is a reminder that the waiting is real, the system is patient, and time is always moving forward, even when their lives feel frozen. This is a reality rarely shown. Not the crime, not the trial, not the final moment, but everything in between. The years where punishment is not an event, but a condition of existence. Because in Texas, a death sentence does not end a life immediately. It changes how life is lived. until the state decides it is time for it to end. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.